Welcome to the Pharma Podcast, conversations with industry experts and business leaders about important and current topics in Canadian pharma, biotech, and medtech. I'm your host, Sam Tarantino. This is a special edition of the Pharma Podcast, recorded from my home office. I, like so many, am doing my part to maintain physical distancing. Today, I am speaking with Daniel Chiasson, President and CEO of the Canadian Association for Pharmacy Distribution Management, CAPDM. Dan is an expert in supply chain management and a leader within the healthcare sector. CAPDM is the authoritative voice representing Canada's pharmacy supply chain. In this episode, Dan will provide insights on Canada's drug supply chain and how CAPDM and its members are facing the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome to the podcast, Dan.
Oh, thank you, Sam, for having me. It's a real pleasure being with you.
Dan, the last few weeks have been unprecedented. If your last few weeks have been anything like mine, I'm sure you have been busier than ever. I've been fielding a lot of questions about Canada's drug supply in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm sure you've been inundated with similar questions. There have recently been some articles published in the news about this specific topic, and some have raised the concern of patients stockpiling drugs. For our audience, is there a message you want to relay about Canada's drug supply chain during the COVID-19 outbreak?
Yeah, first and foremost, let me take the opportunity, Sam, to recognize the work that Frontline healthcare workers are doing in terms of helping us as a population during these very extraordinary times. And when I think about healthcare frontline workers, not only those in the acute care settings, but also those in the community, so namely pharmacists and emergency workers. They're really doing an outstanding job, and they're really heroes. But beyond those that are actually frontline, there's a community of people in the background that ensure that products are flowing to the front lines. And using a bit of a war analogy, where the supplies have to come to those that are fighting the good fight. And so I'm also wishing to recognize an appreciation towards the distributors and the manufacturers of healthcare products, whether they be medical supplies or pharmaceutical supplies, towards our frontline workers and for the benefit of patients overall. But back to your original question around, is there one message? I would say that the supply chain is working well. From a supply perspective, there hasn't been any disruptions in the short term. What we have seen, nevertheless, is some severe spiking of demand, and whether it's for stockpiling reasons or hoarding or fear of the unknown, I'd like to reassure the audience that there isn't any disruptions on the supply side in the short to medium term, and I would actually encourage all the stakeholders to adhere to what I would call responsible ordering. So don't order any more than what you need, and this will allow for others to access their requirements from a supply chain perspective as well.
You recently announced 2 critical work streams to monitor activity and to develop a response. Can you elaborate on what they are?
Yeah, the first one is, again, COVID-19 specific, is to ensure as a community, as pharmaceutical distributors, to ensure that we're doing our utmost to protect the health and safety of the workers that are actually ensuring the flow of medication during these troubling times. So the folks that are in the distribution chain, the folks that are in the warehouses, the folks that are delivering products, making sure that we do our utmost to protect their health and their safety. And we've updated all kinds of health and safety protocols, business continuity protocols, with the primary purpose of not only ensuring the safety of the employees and their families and those that are around them, but also to ensure the stability of the supply chain for the benefit of all Canadians. So that's the first one. The second one is more around the commercial realities of what we're living through right now and ensuring that distributors have as much information as possible coming from the manufacturing community, and conversely that we can communicate the realities of what's happening in the supply chain with our customer groups being pharmacies, both in the community setting and in the hospital settings.
In most provinces in Canada, pharmacies are limiting prescriptions to 30-day supply. Is that the right move?
We believe so. We've actually advocated in support of the pharmacist associations and the colleges of pharmacy for a form of demand management in light of the heavy spikes in demand that occurred early in the pandemic crisis. And so we do believe that the supply chain, from a supply perspective, is functioning well. What we have seen, nevertheless, is because of these demand spikes, we've seen very early onset of shortages that had nothing to do with the supply chain itself, but more from an artificial lift in the demand. Now, we recognize that there are, as a result of COVID-19, increased treatments, or the requirement to increase the treatments for certain applications. But in many cases, what we're seeing is spike in demand across everything. And so what we're, again, favoring is that there be, a pause in terms of not having any panic in the marketplace. There's no need for it. The supply chain is sturdy. And at the same time, asking for the support of government to put the directives forward on the 30-day supply in order to allow everybody to get access to their medication in a timely fashion.
Do manufacturers or wholesalers also have a role to play?
Well, they do. Our role is really to ensure that we're safeguarding the stability of the supply chain by ensuring that the production facilities are operating, that the distribution facilities are also operating, and that the products are flowing smoothly. And I'm happy to report, to date, in spite of the disruption that is happening across the marketplace, that manufacturers and distributors are getting product to the pharmacies to the extent that they're available in light of some of the early onset of shortages that I mentioned caused by spikes in demand.
Should there be demand filters imposed by manufacturers or wholesalers to help mitigate risks of stockpiling and creating the have and have not groups?
Yes, and we're already seeing that in play. Manufacturers have now recognized the elevated demand curve, and they've recognized that there isn't sufficient supply to left unabated. If this demand curve wasn't smoothed out, that there would not be sufficient supply. And when I say sufficient supply, it's not only a Canadian reality, it really is a reality around the world. And so manufacturers are looking at their supply chain in terms of what inventory positions they have currently, what production capacity is available to them, and they've now imposed, in many cases, allocations. And allocations are essentially a way of managing the demand to match the supply and to make sure that there's a fair and equitable distribution of the limited supply availability to the right stakeholders. And from a distributor perspective, even in cases where there isn't a manufacturer allocation, wholesalers and distributors may be imposing some demand filters because they have seen evidence of certain clients coming around and wiping the wholesaler shelves empty. And that creates an imbalance and inequity in the marketplace, where the first one to show up with this order may be getting their unfair share of what supply is available at the expense of somebody else. And so we have seen, as you've mentioned, both allocations from the manufacturers and demand filters imposed by distributors.
Should there be a requirement to share information from industry and to public health agencies to optimize the use of drug supply?
Well, that requirement is absolutely necessary. I'm happy to report that the industry stakeholders and government stakeholders are in close and frequent collaboration to assess the situation with respect to supply on a global and local basis. There hasn't been a supply situation that has warranted public health agencies to step in and what I would call take control of the supply. So they're still able to work with the manufacturers and the distributors to get informed in terms of where inventory positions are and who is in need of inventory, without having to essentially take control and say, regardless of what the manufacturers say or what the distributors are saying, we as a public health agency are going to be imposing our own supply chain. That has not taken place. And the supply chain is working as anticipated at this point in time, but just know that the communication between stakeholders is frequent and very regular.
Did we act soon enough, or did allocation and supply management start too late?
Well, it depends on your perspective on this one, I believe. From my point of view, there was no way that we were expecting the spikes in demand that took place on products that we felt were not necessarily going to be an impact of COVID-19. So there are certain categories of products, inhalers as an example, that we knew because of COVID-19 being a respiratory issue, that there would be some spikes in demand. What we didn't anticipate is spike in demand throughout all categories of drugs and medical supplies. Generally speaking, and that holds true for not only prescription drugs, but for over-the-counter medication as well. So that caught the industry stakeholders off guard, and I don't know that we could have anticipated that. Now, when I come back in terms of anticipating what COVID-19 would have had on certain categories of products, like inhalers, what caught us off guard somewhat is that certain categories of customers changed their clinical protocols. And so that caught us off guard, where typically inhalers were being used in community pharmacy settings for population at large, whereas hospitals were using more nebulizers. But as a result of the being short of staff, the sanitization requirements around nebulizers, there's a change, very rapid change from hospitals to a different clinical protocol to be using inhalers that were otherwise used in a community setting. So that was a double impact in terms of inhaler shortages, and that we didn't anticipate either. So I think the industry is reacting quite rapidly to the fluid situation. In some cases, we were anticipating certain spikes in demand, but we were nevertheless caught off guard by a large proportion of products that we didn't feel needed to be spiked the way that they did spike.
Mm-hmm. Patients are advised to make sure they have enough medications, while pharmacies are saying 30 days is the max that they will fill. Are there mixed public messages?
I think there has been mixed public messages, and I don't think anybody was doing this with ill intent. Much like consumers were flocking to grocery stores to stock up on toilet paper. I think public health agencies wanted to ensure that the consumers and patients were well looked after in terms of their medication in case of a supply disruption. And that sort of worked against us because it sort of sent the fear of supply issues on the drug side that we were seeing on the consumer product side. And so we did see an awful lot of patients showing up at pharmacy looking for early refills, for not only filling their prescription to their 90-day script, but adding more to it, and they would be willing to pay out of pocket for it. And because of that sort of panicked situation, we felt that putting forward and advocating alongside with pharmacy stakeholders the 30-day maximum was the appropriate thing to do in order to safeguard the supply for all patients, and so that you would not create a series of have and have not populations out there.
Yeah. Are you collaborating with Health Canada and the provincial ministries of health to move products to where they are required?
Yeah, so as I mentioned previously, Sam, there's been no directives by the provinces or by Health Canada in terms of where to direct products. The community of all healthcare stakeholders, provinces, Health Canada, and the supply chain actors are very well aware that there's categories of products such as inhalers, such as antivirals like chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine, that surfaced as a result of being potentially a source of treatment. By the way, yet unproven, and so that's creating its own issues in the marketplace. But nevertheless, inhalers, antivirals, and personal protective equipment are categories that the supply chain actors and the governments are closely watching, and in some cases are starting to think about ways of containing and conserving products that are in very short supply to ensure that they find their way to the most needy populations and the most needy geographic areas. But those have not been directives that the government entities, either provincially or federally, have provided at this point, because there's still a sense that things are pretty much landing on where they need to be from an inventory position. And so, but nevertheless, there's some caution signs around those categories of products that we're monitoring very closely.
Dan, if we look outside of Canada, China and India are two major exporters of both bulk API, active pharmaceutical ingredients, and finished drug. China has closed most of its manufacturing facilities, so it appears, and airports as well, as it tries to respond to this crisis. There are reports that some manufacturing capacity is coming back online, but India recently announced a ban on the export of some critical drugs as it tries to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. There are now real fears that this may lead to a global shortage. Is your organization working with industry and government to monitor global activities, and do you anticipate risks in the medium and long term?
Yeah, we're spending quite a bit of time, Sam, on what I would call the more medium to long term impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic crisis. It is true that China did see some disruption. Happy to report that they're coming back online with pretty much full production capacity and product flowing out of China. So in the medium to long term, while there has been some disruption, the supply chain typically has a fair amount of inventory to sort of smooth out these bumps on the road as we see it. But this is much more than a bump in the road, obviously. And So with the 4 or 5 month supply that are in the supply chain right now, some slight interruptions in the production capacity is not too worrisome. And so we're happy to see China back. India is one that we're monitoring very closely. As you've mentioned, they've closed their borders. The production facilities are deemed, the drug facilities are deemed to be part of essential services. We're getting echoes from manufacturers that we're in touch with regularly, and also through our government contacts, that although those production facilities in India are still open, they may not be operating at full capacity because they're not able to get the workers to come to work, and whether those are transportation issues locally or because of other considerations where people are staying at home because of the lockdown. So that's something that we're monitoring very closely, and just getting a sense of how much disruption this could cause. But it's not going to be a short-term impact to our supply chain. It's going to be much more of a medium to longer-term impact, where it could be that 6 months down the road, if we're still dealing with COVID-19, that there may be some accentuation of supply shortages coming out of India.
Apart from COVID-19, are there other potential disruptive forces?
Yeah, and these are issues that drug shortages is not a new phenomenon. It is exacerbated by the fact that we're dealing with a pandemic crisis now. But prior to COVID-19, supply chain actors, such as distributors and manufacturers, have been increasingly concerned about the impacts that certain market forces may have, or market or regulatory forces would have on supply chains. So some of the folks listening in on the podcast today may be familiar with the U.S. efforts to import Canadian drugs as a result of price points in Canada, typically on brand products, being lower than in the U.S. And we, as CAPDM and our distributor members, have been opposed to any regulatory efforts, policy efforts, or efforts of any kind from a foreign entity to access Canadian drugs. It's not the right philosophical approach. In our view, we already have sufficient drug shortages in Canada. Opening up the market to the U.S. population would just exacerbate what we feel are unacceptable drug shortages already in the marketplace. The other regulatory dimension is we're going through a review of regulatory reforms proposed by the PMPRB, so Patent and Medicines Pricing Review Board, where for the right reasons, they're looking at aligning Canada with pricing from other jurisdictions around the world. The unintended consequence of doing that is supply chain in Canada is reimbursed and funded as a percentage of the drug price. And so both pharmacy stakeholders and distributors get reimbursed as a percentage of the drug price. And as the drug price comes down, what we see is the funding model actually erodes as well. We saw this example in 2018 as a result of an agreement between provinces and the generic manufacturers, which had a significant impact to the supply chain actors, and specifically distributors had to realign their cost curve to reflect the new revenue reality of the funding model being eroded. So what we've seen in 2018 with the generic price decrease, excuse me, is a reduction in service levels in terms of frequency of delivery, and also the inventory positions that people have. And so in cases like today, it's beneficial to have large inventory positions in order to smooth out the impact of drug shortages. But the reality is, with the eroding funding model, Sam, it's becoming less and less sustainable for supply chain actors to invest in inventory positions because they just don't have the funding model anymore. And so, much like we actually had these negative impacts happen to us in 2018 because of generic price decreases, we're anticipating with the PMPRB reforms that there's going to be price erosion on the brand products. Regulations are set to come into effect on July 1st of 2020 in a few short months, and that's going to have another detrimental impact on the funding model and is probably going to require another review by distributors of their cost model and their service model to yet again realign on a lower funding model.
Dan, thank you. Thank you so much for your time and leadership during this difficult time. How can the audience connect with you and stay informed on CAPDM developments?
Well, I would encourage people to reach out, and they can do so through my LinkedIn account and or my email is daniel@capdm.ca. And people can also follow our activities, including COVID-19 actions, on the CAPDM website, which is www.capdm.ca.
Contact details for Dan are also available on our website at the pharmapodcast.ca. Thank you for listening to this special edition of the Pharma Podcast. This podcast, along with a transcript of the show, can be found on our website at thepharmapodcast.ca. Thank you to our sound engineer, Errol Francis, in the town of Oakville. Please subscribe and follow me on LinkedIn to stay up to date on future podcasts. If you would like to be a guest on this podcast, or if there is a topic we should cover in future episodes, please connect with me via LinkedIn.